Charles II, the cursed king. They called him His Catholic Majesty, but everyone whispered a different name behind closed doors. The bewitched king, El Hechizado. And when you see what I'm about to show you, you'll understand why an entire empire spent 40 years pretending their ruler wasn't slowly rotting from the inside out. Picture this: you're standing outside the royal birthing chamber in Madrid, 1661. The air reeks of incense and terror. Servants scramble past you, their faces pale as winter snow. Behind those massive oak doors, Spain's queen is screaming. The whole kingdom holds its breath because this baby, this one child, will inherit an empire that stretches from the Americas to the Philippines. Then silence. A midwife stumbles out, blood-soaked hands trembling. She doesn't smile. She doesn't announce a prince. She just stares at the crowd of waiting nobles and whispers 5 words that will haunt Spanish history. He's not right. The baby, lying beside the unconscious queen, isn't crying. He's barely breathing. His tongue is grotesquely swollen, too large for his tiny mouth. His jaw juts out like a broken drawer, and when they try to make him nurse, nothing happens. He can't swallow. He can't even focus his eyes, but here's the thing that'll make your skin crawl. Every single person in that room bows anyway. They applaud, they celebrate, because this malformed infant is royal blood, Habsburg blood. And in 1661, that meant everything. What none of them dared say aloud was what everyone could see. This wasn't a prince. This was a warning, the final, horrific consequence of a dynasty so obsessed with keeping power in the family that they'd been marrying cousins, nieces, and uncles for 200 years. And you want to know the worst part? They were going to crown him king anyway. But before we dive into the nightmare that was Charles II's life, let me ask you something. Have you ever wondered what happens when an entire royal family decides that outsider blood is poison? When they choose genetic purity over, well, basic biology? Drop a comment below and tell me what you think would happen if a family only married within itself for centuries. Trust me, your wildest guess probably doesn't come close to reality. Royal blood. Those 2 words sounded divine, untouchable, sacred. But what the Habsburg dynasty refused to admit was that their royal blood had become something else entirely. Poisoned, twisted. A genetic nightmare that looped back on itself like a snake eating its own tail. To understand how Charles II became such a broken human being, we need to rewind centuries. The Habsburgs had one obsession that trumped everything else: purity. They didn't trust foreigners. They definitely didn't trust commoners. They trusted only themselves. So they married themselves again and again and again. Think about this for a second. Your family tree is supposed to branch out, right? New names, new bloodlines, genetic diversity. The Habsburg family tree didn't branch. It twisted inward like a gnarled, diseased oak. Cousins married cousins, uncles married nieces, and the Spanish and Austrian branches of the family became one grotesque genetic experiment that would make a horror movie writer jealous. Here's where it gets really disturbing. By the time Charles II was born, the inbreeding coefficient among Spanish Habsburgs was higher than what you'd find between actual siblings. Let that sink in. An entire royal lineage had become walking experiments in genetic collapse. They looked magnificent on the outside, draped in silk and crowned with gold. But inside, their bodies were crumbling, their minds slipping, their bloodlines so tangled that each new generation was weaker than the last. And it showed. Oh boy, did it show. The Habsburg jaw wasn't just a family quirk. It was a visible warning sign carved in bone and flesh. Some family members couldn't chew their food properly. Others struggled to speak because their tongues didn't fit in their mouths. Mental illness, epilepsy, and infertility lurked behind every palace portrait. But when Mariana of Austria married Philip IV, the court celebrated. She was perfect Habsburg material. Because she was already a Habsburg, niece and wife to the same man, they shared more genetic material than most parents and children. So when Mariana became pregnant, everyone expected a miracle, a healthy heir to continue the dynasty. Instead, they got Charles, and Charles was no miracle. He was the dynasty's final bill coming due. But here's what really gets me about this story. Even after that horrific birth, even after seeing that broken, barely breathing infant, the court physicians rushed to reassure everyone. "He's just weak," they said. "He'll grow strong." They called it divine. Mystery instead of brain damage, they called his delays contemplative rather than symptomatic, because admitting something was wrong with Charles meant admitting something was fundamentally wrong with the entire House of Habsburg, and that was unthinkable. Now, I want you to imagine something. You're in that palace, and you have to pretend every single day that your king can function normally. What would that do to your mind? Let me know in the comments if you think you could maintain that level of denial for decades. From the moment Charles entered the world, his body betrayed him in ways that would make medieval physicians weep. His head was enormous, a misshapen skull that pulsed unnaturally under candlelight. His tongue was so swollen he couldn't close his mouth, let alone speak clearly as an infant. Nursing was impossible. As a child, he couldn't chew solid food without choking. Picture this scene, the future King of Spain, drooling constantly while nurses mop his chin day and night. His first teeth didn't emerge until he was nearly 4 years old. He couldn't walk until after his 5th birthday, and when he finally did manage to stand, it was with a shambling, uncertain gait that made courtiers turn away in embarrassment. Yet the empire kept clapping, kept smiling, kept pretending everything was absolutely fine. His tutors despaired in private. Charles couldn't read or write with any real fluency. He was described as mentally slow, incapable of concentration, disturbed by loud noises and bright lights. He would stare for hours at flickering candles like they contained the secrets of the universe. When spoken to, he rarely responded. When corrected, he'd throw tantrums like a toddler. There were times he became inexplicably violent, slapping servants, tearing at his own clothing, even chewing the corners of furniture, one ambassador wrote home. The king seems more like a creature preserved by divine accident than a ruler ordained by God. Another simply stated, "He is not long for this world." But Charles lived, not out of strength, but out of sheer grim inertia. His survival became a grotesque political performance, an endurance act that the entire Spanish Empire had to maintain. Here's the truly insidious part. His mother, Queen Mariana, ruled in his place while using her son's broken body as a puppet. She whispered orders behind closed doors, signed decrees in his name, and paraded him before the public like a sacred relic that happened to still be breathing. Every time Charles appeared in public, slumped in his golden litter with glassy eyes and his head lolling to one side, the people were reminded that the king lived, and if he lived, the empire lived, even if both were rotting from within. The court atmosphere turned funeral. Ministers spoke in hushed voices like they were already at a wake. Priests hovered constantly, waiting for a death that somehow never came. Charles was kept in rooms thick with incense to mask the smell of his infections. His bed linens were changed twice daily because he couldn't control basic bodily functions. And still, portrait painters crafted beautiful lies. They gave him strong cheekbones, confident eyes, even hints of a smile. They erased the slack jaw, the vacant stare, the twitching lips that revealed the horrible truth. But here's what really chills me about this whole situation. They still planned for his future. They still whispered about marriage, about heirs, about continuing the bloodline. Even as his bones softened and his mind unraveled, They convinced themselves that Charles would somehow save the dynasty he was born to destroy. What do you think? Could you maintain hope in a situation that hopeless? Let me know in the comments what you would do if you were a courtier in that palace of lies. The Escorial Palace became a theater of denial, where everyone was an actor in the world's most disturbing play. Every servant, every minister, every ambassador learned their lines perfectly. If the king stared blankly through them, he was deep in thought. If he babbled incoherently during council meetings, it was his unique style of governance. If he failed to respond at all, they nodded solemnly and interpreted his silence as divine wisdom. Portrait painters became master magicians, crafting images of Charles II that bordered on complete fantasy. Healthy, poised, regal. They trimmed his jutting jawline, softened his sloped forehead, straightened his hunched shoulders. In paint, he looked like a proper monarch. In flesh, he looked like a dying man dressed for his own funeral. Foreign dignitaries arrived expecting majesty, and found a parade of grotesque theater instead. One French envoy wrote home in horror, "I do not know what frightens me more, the king himself or the way they all pretend he is well." There were state banquets where Charles sat drooling into his goblet, unable to lift his spoon. Musicians played elaborate pieces while he blinked vacantly into space. Court dancers performed while he twitched and mumbled to himself. During one particularly memorable performance, a court dwarf accidentally slipped and said what everyone was thinking. "This is a kingdom ruled by a corpse." The man disappeared by morning. Make of that what you will. But it wasn't just Charles who was disintegrating. The entire fabric of Spanish governance was unraveling. Ministries fell into infighting. Nobles jockeyed desperately for access to Queen Mariana, who wielded real power behind the veil of motherhood. Religious fanatics saw Charles as proof of divine punishment and began infiltrating court life. Priests whispered constantly about exorcisms. Nobles traded rumors of ancient curses when crops failed or storms battered the coasts. People blamed the king's unnatural condition. Some believed he was bewitched. Others believed he was the witch. And through it all, Charles remained at the center like a dying sun in a collapsing solar system. His days were structured down to the minute, not out of royal duty but out of pure terror. Left alone too long, he might harm himself. Made to walk too far, he might collapse. Told the truth about anything, he might scream. Queen Mariana maintained an iron grip on access. She controlled who could speak to him, who could touch him, who could witness his most vulnerable moments. She edited his correspondence, forged his decisions, and spoke his thoughts aloud when words failed him completely. He was a puppet. She was the puppeteer. And together they maintained the most elaborate lie in European history while the empire crumbled around them. In the palace chapel, prayers echoed endlessly. Priests chanted for the king's health, for his mind, for his ability to produce an heir, because despite everything, despite his drooling and seizures and inability to complete sentences, the court was still preparing for marriage. They still believed, or pretended to believe, that Charles could somehow continue the bloodline. But when foreign princesses arrived to meet their potential husband, reality crashed through the illusion like a hammer through glass. Here's where the story gets even more disturbing. If you can imagine that, by the time Charles turned 20, the whispers had grown into thunder. They called him El Hechizado, the bewitched king, as if his afflictions could be blamed on dark magic instead of centuries of genetic catastrophe. His deterioration was accelerating beyond anyone's ability to cover it up. His jaw sagged open constantly, a string of drool threading down his chin like a broken faucet. His hair fell out in clumps. His skin took on a waxy, yellow hue like a candle left too close to flame. And still he ruled. Still he sat on that throne, a monument to decay wrapped in velvet and crowned with gold. Marriage became the court's next great fiction. They desperately needed an heir, needed to prove that this broken shell of a man could somehow produce offspring. So they chose Marie-Louise of Orleans, niece to Louis XIV of France. A vibrant 17-year-old girl, completely unprepared for the nightmare awaiting her. On their wedding night, she was led to the royal bedchamber like a sacrifice to some ancient, terrible god. Charles lay waiting, naked, trembling, confused about what was expected of him. What happened in that room became the stuff of whispered legend. Some say he wept, some say he prayed. Others claim he simply stared at her, utterly bewildered, until attendants were summoned to explain the basics of human reproduction. Whatever the truth, one fact became crystal clear. No child was conceived. Not that night, not ever. Doctors swarmed the palace. Remedies were prepared with increasing desperation. Spanish fly, ground pearls, even powdered deer penis. Priests chanted over the royal bed. Surgeons conducted examinations that probably traumatized everyone involved. But there was no remedy for what had been passed down through generations of incest. Charles was sterile. His body as incapable of creating life as his mind was of grasping reality. Queen Marie-Louise withered beside him like a flower in poisoned soil. She stopped eating, stopped smiling, and before long she was dead at 26, officially from intestinal obstruction, unofficially from despair so profound it became a physical disease. Charles wailed at her funeral, tearing out his hair in clumps. He begged to sleep beside her corpse, convinced she would somehow return to life. Within a year, they found him another wife, Maria Anna of Neuburg this time, a strong-willed German. Princess who arrived with an army of priests and a team of midwives. Her singular mission, bear an heir at any cost. The result was exactly the same. Months of humiliation, silence, and no children. But here's what really gets me about this period. Charles wasn't just failing as a king or as a husband, he was aging like spoiled fruit, rotting from the inside out while everyone pretended not to notice the smell. By 30, he looked 70. His bones bent under their own weight. His teeth fell out completely. Food had to be pureed and spooned into his mouth by servants who whispered prayers while feeding him. He couldn't climb stairs, couldn't read, couldn't remember conversations from hour to hour, and still that crown sat on his malformed head. The court abandoned medicine in favor of pure superstition. They stripped Charles naked and poured holy water over his decaying body. They burned herbs beneath his bed and demanded he confess to sins he couldn't comprehend. One priest declared that a Moorish sorcerer had cursed the king as punishment for his ancestors' sins. No one mentioned chromosomes. No one whispered about genetics. The truth was too horrible, too complicated, too damning for the entire system they'd built their lives around. Charles wasn't bewitched. He was the Habsburg legacy made flesh, a living warning written in bone and blood. But acknowledging that would mean acknowledging that their entire worldview was built on a lie, so they kept propping him up like a sacred relic, treating every breath as a miracle and every twitch as divine communication. Because if Charles died without an heir, Spain would collapse. There was no plan B, no backup, no one else. What would you do in that situation? When the lie becomes too big to abandon, but too obvious to maintain? Drop a comment and let me know if you think there was any way out of this nightmare. By the time Charles reached his 30s, everyone knew he was dying, but nobody knew how long it would take. His body had been rotting in slow motion since birth, yet it clung to life with the same desperate inertia that held the Spanish Empire together, decaying, but not quite dead yet. The court had transformed into a battlefield of whispers where everyone wanted to know the same terrifying question. Who inherits when Charles finally stops breathing? Because there were no children, no heirs. His marriages had produced nothing but sorrow and international embarrassment. Foreign powers circled like vultures. France and Austria both had blood claims to the throne, and their armies were already mobilizing before Charles had even drawn his last breath. In desperation, Charles dictated a will. Though even that document became a contested mess, courtiers manipulated it. Foreign agents revised it. Priests rewrote sections completely. Every major European power had their own puppet claimant ready to go. War was inevitable. Everyone could feel it building like a storm on the horizon. Charles's final years were a masterclass in biological horror. His heart turned black, his lungs filled with fluid. His intestines became gangrenous. His testicles, according to the physicians brave enough to examine them, were atrophied and completely non-functional. When he finally died in 1700 at the age of 38, his autopsy shocked even the most jaded medical professionals. His body weighed barely 100 pounds. His blood had turned thick as oil. His organs were so damaged that doctors couldn't understand how he'd lived as long as he did. There were no sons to bury him, no heirs to inherit his broken crown, only the sound of church bells echoing across a grieving empire and a silence too vast to fill. With Charles II, the Spanish Habsburgs died completely, and in their place, a war ignited that would engulf all of Europe, redraw international borders, and reshape the balance of global power for centuries. The War of Spanish Succession lasted over a decade, killed hundreds of thousands, and left the Spanish Empire shattered beyond repair. The Americas would eventually rebel. The treasury would empty completely. The world would move on. But the lesson remains, carved in the bones of a king who should never have been born. Charles II didn't lose his empire through incompetence or bad decisions. He was the loss, the final consequence of a system that believed power could be passed like jewelry, regardless of the genetic cost. His life wasn't marked by what he accomplished, but by what he represented. A dynasty so obsessed with purity that it bred itself into extinction. A warning about what happens when bloodlines matter more than biology, when rulers believe themselves above the laws of nature. But here's what makes his story truly terrifying. It wasn't the grotesque decay of his body that should haunt us. It was how long everyone kept pretending everything was normal. The silence, the complicity, the gold-trimmed theater that surrounded his suffering for 40 years. Because nobody wanted to admit that the entire system had failed, Charles II didn't destroy the Spanish Empire. The empire destroyed itself and used him to do it. A machine that kept running long after it should have stopped, fueled by superstition, vanity, and poisoned blood, until the last king of Spain's greatest dynasty sat drooling on his throne while the world collapsed around him. And nobody dared speak the truth. This wasn't just the death of a monarch. This was what happens when power devours itself. And that's a lesson worth remembering. Whether you're talking about 17th century Spain, or any other system that confuses tradition with wisdom, blood with merit, or silence with loyalty. So, here's my question for you. What modern institutions or systems do you think might be making similar mistakes? What are we all pretending is normal when it clearly isn't? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one, and some of your insights might end up in future videos. And if this story of genetic catastrophe and royal denial fascinated you as much as it horrified you, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Because trust me, history is full of cautionary tales just as disturbing and just as relevant as Charles II's reign of horrors. But we're just getting started with this nightmare. Because Charles II's story isn't just about one broken king, it's about an entire system of royal madness that infected courts across Europe. And the ripple effects of his genetic catastrophe would echo through history in ways that'll make your head spin. Let me paint you another picture. While Charles was drooling on his Spanish throne, Other royal families across Europe were watching in horror, not because they felt sorry for him, but because they recognized something terrifying in his twisted features. They saw their own futures staring back at them. The House of Habsburg wasn't the only royal dynasty playing genetic Russian roulette. They were just the most spectacularly successful at failing. But across the continent, from the palaces of Versailles to the castles of Vienna, royal families were making the exact same mistakes, just on a slightly smaller scale. And here's what really gets me about this whole situation. They all knew. Every single European court knew exactly what was happening in Spain. They had ambassadors, they had spies. They had detailed reports about Charles's condition, yet they kept making the same choices, generation after generation. Why? Because the alternative was unthinkable. Admitting that royal blood could be poisoned meant admitting that maybe, just maybe, they weren't chosen by God after all. Let me take you deeper into this rabbit hole of royal dysfunction, because Charles II's story is just the tip of an iceberg made entirely of bad decisions and worse genetics. The Habsburg family tree, if you can even call it that, reads like a medical textbook of genetic disorders. Charles's great-great-grandfather, Charles V, had the classic Habsburg jaw so pronounced that he couldn't chew his food properly. His great-grandfather, Philip II, suffered from gout so severe he couldn't walk without assistance. His grandfather, Philip III, was described by his own advisors as simple-minded and incapable of making decisions. And here's the kicker. Each generation the problems got worse, not better. It's like they were conducting a centuries-long experiment to see just how badly they could break human genetics. Charles's father, Philip IV, managed to produce over 30 children with various mistresses, but only one legitimate heir survived to adulthood. That's not a coincidence, that's a genetic system in complete collapse. But the most chilling part? They documented everything. Palace physicians kept detailed records of births, deaths, deformities, and illnesses. They knew exactly what they were doing to their own bloodline. They just couldn't stop themselves, because stopping meant admitting that commoner blood might actually be better than royal blood, and that was heresy of the highest order. Now, you might be wondering, how did other countries react to Spain's genetic meltdown? Did they learn from Charles' example? Did they start marrying outside their bloodlines to avoid the same fate? Here's your answer. Absolutely not. If anything, Charles II's reign made other royal families double down on their own inbreeding practices. Because in their twisted logic, Charles wasn't proof that incest was dangerous. He was proof that the Spanish branch of the Habsburg family wasn't pure enough. I know that sounds insane, but remember, we're dealing with people who believed that God personally selected their family to rule over millions of human beings. Logic wasn't exactly their strong suit. Let me tell you about some of the other royal disasters that were happening simultaneously across Europe. In France, Louis XIV was so obsessed with maintaining royal purity that he married his own first cousin. Their children suffered from a laundry list of genetic problems, but the French court blamed it on everything except the obvious. In England, the Stuart dynasty was busy marrying within their own extended family tree, producing a line of kings so prone to mental illness and physical deformity that they eventually lost their heads. Literally, in some cases. And in Austria, the other branch of the Habsburg family was conducting their own genetic experiments, creating a parallel line of rulers so physically and mentally compromised that they made Charles II look healthy by comparison. But here's what really disturbs me about this period. It wasn't just the royal families who were complicit in this madness. It was entire court systems, medical establishments, religious hierarchies, and political structures that all collaborated to maintain the lie. Think about it. Thousands of people, from palace servants to international ambassadors, knew exactly what was happening. They saw the drooling, the seizures, the mental breakdowns, the physical deformities. They documented it. They wrote about it in private letters. They whispered about it in palace corridors. But publicly? Silence, complete. Orchestrated silence. And that level of institutional denial doesn't happen by accident. It requires active participation from every level of society, which means this wasn't just a story about one broken king. It was a story about an entire civilization choosing comfortable lies over uncomfortable truths. What do you think about that? Have you ever seen that kind of mass denial in modern institutions? Drop a comment and let me know if you think we're still capable of that level of collective self-deception. Now, let's talk about what was happening behind the scenes during Charles's reign, because the public theater was just the tip of the iceberg, while the court was busy pretending their king was functional. The real business of running an empire was happening in shadowy backrooms and secret meetings. Queen Mariana, Charles's mother, wasn't just a grieving parent trying to protect her disabled son. She was a master manipulator who used her son's condition as a shield for her own political ambitions. For nearly 2 decades, she was the real ruler of Spain, making decisions that affected millions of people across 4 continents. And she was good at it, terrifyingly good. Mariana developed an intricate system of control that would make modern political operatives jealous. She controlled access to Charles, deciding who could speak to him and when. She interpreted his mumbled responses as royal decrees. She forged his signature on important documents. She even hired actors to impersonate his voice during official ceremonies. But here's the really chilling part. She convinced Charles that he was actually making these decisions through a combination of manipulation, medication, and sheer psychological abuse. She created a puppet who genuinely believed he was pulling his own strings. Palace servants reported that Charles would sometimes ask his mother for permission to use the bathroom. He would thank her for allowing him to eat. He genuinely believed that his mother's voice in his head was his own thoughts, and the courtiers went along with it. They bowed to Charles while taking orders from Mariana. They praised his wisdom while watching her write his speeches. They celebrated his decisions while knowing she made every single one. It was the most elaborate gaslighting operation in human history, and it worked for decades. But Mariana wasn't the only puppet master in this palace of horrors. The Spanish court was full of people who used Charles's condition for their own ends. Nobles who whispered suggestions in his ear and claimed he'd made royal proclamations. Priests who convinced him that God was speaking through them directly. Foreign agents who fed him information and claimed it came from his own brilliant insights. Charles became a human ventriloquist dummy, and everyone wanted to be the voice. The most disturbing part? Charles never realized what was happening to him. In his damaged mind, he was a competent king making important decisions for his empire. The constant praise and validation from his handlers convinced him that he was not just capable, but divinely gifted. Palace physicians kept him on a cocktail of medications that kept him docile and suggestible. They told him the drugs were making him stronger and more intelligent. He believed them because he had no choice. His reality was entirely constructed by the people around him. And here's what really gets me about this whole situation. It worked for 40 years. This elaborate charade functioned well enough to keep the Spanish Empire from complete collapse. Not thriving, mind you, but surviving. Which raises a terrifying question. How many other political systems throughout history have been elaborate charades designed to hide the incompetence of their leaders? How many kings, presidents, and emperors have been nothing more than puppets in expensive clothing? Think about that next time you watch a political speech or a royal ceremony. How much of what you're seeing is real, and how much is just very expensive theater? Let me know in the comments if you think modern political systems might have their own versions of Charles II. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on whether we've learned anything from this historical nightmare. Now, While all this political puppet theater was playing out in Madrid, the rest of Europe was watching with a mixture of horror and opportunism, because everyone knew that Charles II wasn't going to live forever. And when he died, the largest empire in human history would be up for grabs. The War of Spanish Succession didn't start when Charles died in 1700. It started decades earlier, in the minds of European rulers who were already planning how to carve up Spain's territories. Charles's genetic catastrophe had created a power vacuum that every major nation wanted to fill. Louis XIV of France saw an opportunity to expand French influence across the Iberian Peninsula and into the Americas. The Austrian Habsburgs wanted to reunify their dynasty and reclaim Spanish territories. England and Holland were terrified of either outcome and started forming their own alliances. But here's what makes this period really fascinating from a historical perspective. These weren't just military preparations. They were elaborate diplomatic dances where everyone pretended to respect Charles's sovereignty while secretly negotiating how to divide his empire after his death. Imagine being Charles II during this period. You're struggling with basic cognitive functions. You can barely control your bodily functions. You're completely dependent on handlers for every aspect of daily life. And meanwhile, the most powerful rulers in Europe are having dinner parties where they casually discuss how to split up your empire like it's a pie. The level of disrespect is staggering, but it also reveals something important about how power really works. Charles had the title, the crown, the palaces, all the external trappings of absolute monarchy. But he had zero actual power, because power isn't about titles or bloodlines. It's about the ability to make decisions and enforce them. And Charles couldn't make decisions about what to eat for breakfast, let alone how to run an empire. Foreign ambassadors would visit the Spanish court and file reports that read like medical case studies. They described Charles's physical appearance, his mental state, his daily routines, his handler's behavior. These weren't diplomatic reports. They were intelligence assessments designed to help their governments plan for Spain's inevitable collapse. One English ambassador wrote, "The Catholic king appears to be more dead than alive. His body is so weak that he can barely support the weight of his clothing, and his mind so clouded that he cannot follow a conversation for more than a few sentences. I estimate that the Spanish monarchy has perhaps 5 years remaining before complete dissolution." That report was written in 1690. Charles lived for another decade. But the ambassador's assessment of the monarchy's weakness was spot on, because while Charles was slowly dying in his palace, the Spanish Empire was disintegrating around him. Colonial territories were rebelling. Trade routes were being disrupted by pirates and foreign navies. The treasury was empty, the military was demoralized, the bureaucracy was corrupt and incompetent, and nobody was in charge, not really. Oh, they had the forms and ceremonies of government. They had councils and ministers and official procedures. But when your head of state can't understand basic concepts like cause and effect, the entire system starts to break down at a fundamental level. Regional governors started making their own decisions without consulting. Madrid, military commanders began following orders from foreign powers instead of their own king. Colonial administrators started negotiating directly with other European governments. The Spanish Empire was becoming a zombie state, technically alive, but functionally dead. And here's the really tragic part. Spain had been the dominant global power for over a century. They controlled vast territories in the Americas, Europe, and Asia. They had access to incredible wealth from silver mines, spice trades, and colonial agriculture. They had some of the most advanced technology and military capabilities in the world. But all of that meant nothing when your political system was built around the assumption that one man could single-handedly manage a global empire. And when that one man turned out to be genetically incapable of managing his own basic needs, everything else collapsed like a house of cards. This is why Charles II's story isn't just about royal inbreeding or genetic disorders. It's about the dangers of concentrating too much power in too few hands, especially when those hands are chosen by accidents of birth rather than actual competence. What do you think would happen if a modern democracy elected a leader with Charles II's level of cognitive impairment? Would the system adapt? Would other institutions step in? Would we even recognize the problem, or would we just create our own version of the Spanish court's elaborate denial? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Do you think our modern political systems are more resilient than 17th century monarchy? Or are we just as vulnerable to institutional breakdown when leadership fails? But let's get back to Charles himself, because his personal story gets even more heartbreaking as we approach his final years. By 1690, when he was 30 years old, Charles had stopped growing. Not just physically, but mentally and emotionally. He remained trapped in a perpetual childhood, confused by the adult world around him, but desperate for approval and affection. Palace servants described him as pathetically grateful for any small kindness. He would weep with joy when someone remembered his name or brought him a sweet treat. He collected toys and played with them when he thought no one was watching. He was afraid of shadows, loud noises, and unfamiliar faces. In many ways, Charles II was the ultimate victim of his family's obsession with royal purity. He never had a choice about his condition, his role, or his fate. He was born into a nightmare that had been centuries in the making, and he spent his entire life paying the price for decisions made by ancestors he never knew. But here's what really breaks my heart about his story. Despite everything, despite his obvious limitations and constant suffering, Charles tried to be a good king. In his confused, childlike way, he genuinely wanted to help his people and serve his empire. Palace records show that he would sometimes ask his handlers to read him reports about famines or disasters in his territories, and he would weep when he learned about his subjects' suffering. He would ask what he could do to help, and his advisors would pat him on the head and tell him not to worry about it. He once tried to give away his personal jewelry to help fund disaster relief, but his mother stopped him because it would have been undignified for a king to appear in public without his royal ornaments. Charles lived in a gilded cage, surrounded by luxury, but completely isolated from any meaningful human connection. His wife was essentially a stranger who had been forced into marriage with him for political reasons. His mother treated him like a precious but fragile object rather than a person. His courtiers saw him as a useful tool or an unfortunate obstacle, depending on their own ambitions. He had no friends, no confidants, no one who cared about him as an individual rather than as a symbol or a problem to be managed. And yet he kept trying. Right up until the end, he kept trying to fulfill his role as king, even when that role was completely beyond his capabilities. There's something profoundly tragic about that level of determination in the face of impossible circumstances. Charles II may have been the product of genetic catastrophe and political dysfunction, but he was also a human being who deserved better than the hand he was dealt. His story reminds us that behind every political system, every royal dynasty, every empire, there are real people whose lives are shaped by forces beyond their control. Charles didn't choose to be born into the Habsburg bloodline. He didn't choose to inherit a genetically damaged body and mind. He didn't choose to become the symbol of his dynasty's failure. But he did choose, in his limited way, to keep trying to be the best king he could be, even when that meant nothing more than sitting quietly on his throne while other people made all the real decisions. That's not heroism exactly, but it's not nothing either. It's the quiet dignity of someone who refuses to give up, even when giving up would be completely understandable. What do you think? Does Charles II deserve our sympathy, or was he just a privileged royal who happened to have genetic problems? Let me know in the comments how you feel about his personal story versus his historical significance. Now, as Charles entered his final decade, the pretense became increasingly difficult to maintain. His physical deterioration was accelerating beyond anyone's ability to hide it. His mental state was declining. His seizures were becoming more frequent and more severe, but the court doubled down on their denial. If anything, they became more elaborate in their deceptions, more creative in their explanations, more desperate in their attempts to maintain the illusion of royal competence. They hired teams of makeup artists to make Charles look healthier during public appearances. They used special clothing to disguise his physical deformities. They coached him on simple phrases he could repeat during ceremonies, even though he rarely understood what he was saying. They created an entire industry around managing the king's image, employing hundreds of people whose only job was to make Charles II appear functional enough to remain on the throne. And it worked, sort of. Foreign observers noted that Charles looked terrible and clearly had serious health problems, but most assumed he was just sickly rather than fundamentally incapacitated. The Spanish court's propaganda machine was sophisticated enough to create plausible alternative explanations for his obvious limitations. He was described as contemplative rather than mentally impaired, delicate rather than physically deformed, pious rather than confused and frightened. But by the mid-1690s, even the most skillful spin doctors couldn't hide the reality anymore. Charles was dying, visibly and dramatically, and everyone knew it. That's when the court turned to increasingly desperate measures. They brought in exorcists, convinced that Charles had been cursed by enemy sorcerers. They tried every folk remedy and medical treatment available, no matter how bizarre or dangerous. They fed him mercury, thinking it would purify his blood. They bled him regularly, believing it would balance his humors. They gave him enemas made from exotic herbs and animal products. They even tried trepanation, drilling holes in his skull to release evil spirits. None of it worked, of course. If anything, these treatments probably made his condition worse. But they couldn't admit that the problem wasn't supernatural or medical. It was genetic, and therefore unfixable by any means available to 17th century science. The desperation of Charles's final years reveals something important about the limits of power and denial. You can lie to yourself and others for a while. You can create elaborate systems of deception. You can throw unlimited resources at a problem. But eventually, reality wins. Biology doesn't care about your political needs or your royal bloodline or your centuries of tradition. When your genetic code is fundamentally broken, no amount of prayer or propaganda can fix it. Charles II died as he had lived, surrounded by people who were paid to care about him, but who saw him primarily as a problem to be managed rather than a person to be loved. And when he finally stopped breathing, the relief in the palace was almost palpable. The great charade was finally over. The last Habsburg king of Spain was dead, and the empire could stop pretending he had ever been capable of ruling it. But here's the final twist in this already twisted story. Even in death, Charles II couldn't escape the dysfunction of his dynasty. His funeral became another exercise in elaborate denial, with speeches praising his wisdom and leadership, portraits showing him as a strong and capable ruler, and ceremonies designed to convince history that he had been a great king. They buried the lie along with the man, and for centuries many historians went along with it. It's only in recent decades, with advances in genetic science and more honest historical scholarship, that we've been able to understand the true scope of the Habsburg genetic catastrophe and Charles II's role as both victim and symbol. His story isn't just about the past. It's a warning about what happens when institutions become more important than truth, when tradition becomes more valuable than competence, when the appearance of legitimacy matters more than actual effectiveness. And those are lessons that remain relevant today, whether we're talking about politics, business, religion, or any other human institution that claims authority based on tradition rather than results. So let me ask you one final question. What would you do if you found yourself in a system like the Spanish Habsburg court? Would you have the courage to speak truth to power, or would you go along with the comfortable lies? It's easy to judge from a distance, but Charles II's story reminds us that ordinary people can become complicit in extraordinary deceptions, especially when the alternative means losing everything they've worked for. Think about that next time you encounter institutional dysfunction in your own life, and remember that sometimes the most powerful act of rebellion is simply refusing to pretend that obvious problems don't exist, because the truth always wins eventually, even if it takes centuries to surface, and the cost of denial is always higher than the cost of honesty, even when honesty seems impossible. Charles II's genetic nightmare ended in 1700, but the lessons of his reign echo through history, reminding us that power without competence is not just dangerous, it's ultimately unsustainable, and that's a truth worth remembering, no matter what century you're living in.